What's up, you guys? What if I came here and told you that the best, or arguably the best, avian diet is the most affordable, it's the easiest to prepare, and it's the most nutritionally complete? Well, if that interests you, then you should definitely watch the rest of the video where I have Stephanie Rosenblum, who you might also know from Petrie the Tiny Dinosaur, on. And she is really smart and awesome, and she has her PhD in chemistry from Cornell. And we just discuss the ins and outs of avian nutrition. We compare the three main diets in this video that we see kind of spreading through the companion parrot niche, which is which are the fortified pellet diet, the unfortified pelleted diet, and the unfortified unpelleted diet, or I should say pellet-free diet. But just keep in mind, I've created chapters below that you can click through this video. It is, again, it's a long video. I really recommend that you watch the entire thing, maybe when you're doing chores around the house or driving in your car, more like a podcast, because it's very interesting. I just love being able to get down to the nitty-gritty of what is going on, especially with just like unethical marketing and like how these companies get us to sway one way or the other based off of fear. And I can say from my own experience with Bogey, I've fallen into this many times. We see these unethical forms of marketing everywhere in our lives, not only in pet food. So I really hope that you guys enjoy, and let us know what you think down below. Okay, so we're here, and we are here to talk about diets, right? Because recently we've just been noticing on social media, lots gets lost in translation when it comes to avian diets. We see so much conflicting information on fortified diets versus unfortified diets, and it gets really confusing. I personally have been very confused in the past, and Bogey has been on so many different diets. And I think meeting Stephanie has been amazing. Just a little quick intro. I know I already introed her before, but she's kind of my avian nutrition guru, and she's here to talk about just clearing up, I guess, just clearing up some myths and confusion when it comes to avian diets. And we really want you guys to be empowered to make your own decisions when it comes to what your bird needs. Our goal is really for you guys to understand this stuff well and to make your own educated decisions based off of the science and not just what a bunch of people are saying on the internet in these 5-second clips, right? What I think we first should talk about is this whole misunderstanding about pellets and just like what do we see on social media right now. I'm seeing kind of this push towards an unpelleted diet. I see the fortified diets, just more of the traditional, people who stick to what they know, and then I see the unfortified diets.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the times on social media, what we see is a difference between what is popular to talk about and what you see a lot of social media influencers talking about, even in such a niche community like our companion parrot community, and even in a more niche topic like companion parrot nutrition. You start to see these differences between what's going on there on social media and what you might be hearing from sources like your avian veterinarian. And that to me is always a sign that we really need to take a step back, think a little bit deeper about why are these differences here, and how can I, a companion parrot owner who's just trying to do best by their bird, how can I be connected with evidence-based information so that I can make informed decisions about something as vitally important as my parrot's diet. Remember, we go to our avian veterinarians to make sure that our birds are healthy. We trust them with being able to tell us if our bird is healthy, if they're sick. We trust them in emergency situations and, to do surgery and everything. But for whatever reason, there seems to be a little bit of a wall up when it comes to trusting their advice, when it comes to something as fundamental as preventative medicine. And nutrition is a part of that. Nutrition is preventative medicine. So that's really where I become really passionate about talking about this, because I'm not a veterinarian. I'm not an animal scientist. That's not what my credentials are in, but I am really passionate about science communication. I have my PhD in chemistry. I have a decade of research experience behind me. And what I see happening a lot in social media is there just being a misunderstanding of that scientific information, or large social media accounts sometimes cherry picking that scientific information to fit their narrative. And that's where we come in. That's one of our main missions at Nerdy Bird Collective, is to kind of bridge that gap between the average companion parrot owner and what the science is telling us.
I also see a big, I guess what worries me in this wall that you were describing is the whole fact that a lot of people get so caught up in almost this guilt and shame that they end up reverting back to something that's even more dangerous than this so-called, maybe sugary pellet or pellet with food coloring in it or whatever they were doing. They almost revert back to something, or they do revert back to something more dangerous that ends up having more serious complications for the parrot in the end, when they weren't really that far off to begin with. And then it's like, totally, we get these messages from people whose parrots need to be going to the vet, or they need to be seeing someone in a professional light, and we're kind of like, oh no, we just see the aftermath of this, which is why we're here, because we want to help people. And little disclaimer, Stephanie and I were talking about this before, this video is in no way meant to scare anyone into any specific diet. We're not selling any specific diet. I have been all over the place with Bogey's diet, still figuring out with Stephanie. And Stephanie's had her fair share of trial and errors with pellets and diets as well. So that's at least what I really want you all to take away from this. This is not a sales pitch. This is just us sharing really cool information.
So some of the specific things that we often see going around on social media are people or companies warning against certain ingredients or demonizing those ingredients. And this is a really common strategy. This is fear-based marketing. And what ingredients do matter to a certain extent. How digestible those ingredients are, for example, is really important. So there is value in understanding what the ingredients are in a pellet, but the problem arises when that's the only information we're provided. When the story becomes about the ingredient list, and usually it's not even about what's in the pellet, it's about what's not in the pellet. When that becomes the story, and we aren't given information about the overall nutrient content of that diet, we're only getting a very, very small part of the story. We can't make informed decisions if we aren't given the information we need. And what we need to know is not what's not in the pellet. What we need to know is what are the macronutrient content, what's the micronutrient content, your vitamins and your minerals. All these things are really important. Nutrition science is a really complex field. It's not something that can just be hacked, and it's not something that you can just, I don't know how I want to say this.
Just like what sounds good, what sounds natural, what sounds pure, what sounds like what the birds would be eating in the wild.
Right.
That's kind of where people stray. Like, I know personally, getting a bag of dry mix, it's like, oh, this looks natural. This looks like something Bogey would forage for in Australia. And it's like, I have no idea what is really going on in that diet. And if I were to solely base that decision off of just assumptions, it's dangerous.
Yeah. I think that, we encounter food in our everyday life, and it can give us this false sense of security in feeling like we are equipped to be able to make these decisions. But it is really important to recognize that this is a complex field. Nutrition science is really complex, and we're going to get into it a little bit. But even if you break it down and you look at specific nutrient contents in the food, something might look really good on paper, but it might not translate to actually being available nutrients for your animal. What works for a human is not necessarily going to be the same thing as what works for, a bird, for one. So that's something that's really important to recognize. Another thing that you kind of touched on is things like selectivity issues. A diet is only good if your bird actually eats it, right? And they need to eat it in its entirety. If you have something that has little pieces that can be really easily taken apart, you can end up with selectivity issues. This is one of the big issues that we have with seed mixes. You can have on paper, a really well balanced seed mix, but in practice, the bird can be really selective about it and end up with nutritional deficiencies, which is so common.
Well, let me just say, with Bogey, he would
Thing.
be the one to pick everything out that's like high fat, like Bogey is such a challenge when it comes to diets. And it's good because it's like great experience for me to witness. We have to be careful about messaging and what we see on, certain companies' websites and like what they're projecting out there for the world to see, because it might not be all that honest. And one of my favorite examples of this is we were talking about, this is gross, but tampons, woohoo, tampons, it's not gross. But you see on tampons how they have like, we don't use bleach thing, right? And it's
Yep.
like, that doesn't mean that other companies use bleach. They're just using that as a tactic to scare you into buying their product, because you're like, oh, God forbid I buy any tampon with bleach. So this tactic, I'm sure there's a fancy term for it.
I'm sure there is,
I
but
don't know it, but
yeah.
you have to be careful, because this is what we're faced with every day with everything, not just our parrots' food. It's in every aspect of our lives as humans. Like, we are constantly being manipulated into buying certain things.
It does pop up in so many areas, and you see this a lot. You see demonizing certain ingredients, for example, no corn, no soy, no peanuts, no added vitamins and minerals, which those are added for a reason, a very good reason. All these kind of free of this, and that kind of terminology it's really misleading. It's sending a really wrong message, because of course it's sending the message that, well, we're free of these things because there must be something wrong with them, when there's not evidence to support that. And you will see really commonly companies say, no X, Y, and Z compounds that are just not used in other products.
Right.
It's like when you see non-GMO salt, there's no point in saying it's non-GMO. There's no genetic material. It's sodium chloride.
It's
right?
like, it's like seeing fat-free Skittles. You're like,
Exactly. There's nothing, it wasn't there to begin with.
Right.
Or gluten-free Cheerios. They've always been gluten-free, but as soon as gluten-free started to be a trending topic and a trending diet, they started marketing it that way, right? So we do need to be really aware of these things, especially where it impacts something as fundamental as our pet's health.
Especially with parrots being so sensitive as it is.
Yeah, definitely.
They require specific, balanced diet.
Yeah. And if you want to read more, I could go on about this.
Shameless plug, go check out our fillers blog that Stephanie wrote. She did a great job describing just all those harmful filler ingredients that we need to stay away from. But in reality, a lot of these ingredients have been demonized because of just politics. Like, it's literally has nothing to do with our health.
We also have another blog post just talking about, so-called healthy bird food, or the healthiest bird food. And that dives into some of these topics of, marketing and baseless claims as it pertains to parrot nutrition in even greater detail. So definitely check that out if this is a topic that really interests you.
I'll link it.
To what I've been saying on social media a lot is not only this demonizing of certain ingredients and people, companies warning you to stay away from certain types of diets. It's usually, if not all the time, coupled with the promotion of a different diet, usually one that they are profiting from. So that for me is also always a red flag. So those are the three types of diets that I wanted to look into: this kind of fortified diet, the unfortified but still pelleted based diet, and the unfortified pellet free diet. What I'm going to walk you through is some data that I've compiled using. You can do this if you are interested. You can use a nutrition calculator that is just freely available online. If you're interested, I can show you what Excel sheets look like from this. You can't talk about nutrition without math. There is a lot of math involved in this field. And if you don't like math, if you don't like making spreadsheets, this is not for you. Please feel free to come talk to me, reach out. I love doing this. I'm more than happy to help you. So what we're looking at here are three different diets, like I mentioned. I'm calling them fortified, unfortified, and unfortified pellet free. These three diets are comparable in that they are all providing the same amount of energy or calories, and they are all providing approximately the same amount of protein. And that's kind of how they're standardized. So if you're curious, I made this all in mind with my bird, my Alexandrian parrot Petrie, who requires about 55 calories a day, which is an adorably small number.
And Stephanie, how do you calculate your parrot's like caloric need in case people want to reach out to you? Because that's also something that Stephanie has helped me out with. And if you guys, because I remember when I was doing my first conversion diet with Bogey, I never knew how much pellet to give him. I was like, what do I do? So
yeah. So first of all, you'll need to know your bird's estimated caloric need. So you can check out our diet guide, which is available for free. In the diet guide, there are various calculations that you'll have to use in order to calculate the caloric needs of your parrot. It's based off of their approximate activity levels. So there's a paper that defines this by different housing conditions. And it will also vary with the different species of parrot you have, if they are a neotropical bird, if they are, originating from drier climates like Australia or New Zealand. Those types of birds have higher metabolic rates than neotropical birds and require more calories compared to birds of similar sizes. So you need to calculate the caloric needs. The calculations for that are in our diet guide. And then once you know that, you also need to know the caloric content of the food that you're feeding. You want to look at this in terms of calories or kilocalories, that's the unit there, per gram of food. Pellets on average have about 3.4 calories per gram. So, once you know your bird's caloric needs, which is based off of their weight and their species and their activity levels, you can just simply divide that by the number of calories per gram in the food and get the gram output of what you're feeding. It becomes more complicated when you're feeding a varied diet where you're not only feeding foods that have the same energy density or caloric density. So again, this can get really complex. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to help. And we do offer consults on our website as well. So if you have kind of complex needs and you really want to formulate a diet that works for you, we do have options for that available.
Mm-hmm. I'll link everything below as well.
So as you can see here, between these three diets, the calories, that's this metabolizable energy for poultry. That's what we use here to look at the calories in the diet. They're approximately the same across these diets. This pink dashed line is showing you for the fortified diet, and you can see this orange is for the unfortified but still containing pellet diet, and the gray is the unfortified pellet-free diet. So we're pretty similar across calories and crude protein. We are really similar in crude fat, crude fiber, and moisture for the unfortified pelleted diet, but for the unfortified pellet-free diet, we do have a lot less fat in the diet, we have less fiber, and this is what's really, really important. We have way more moisture in the diet, and that can make it really difficult for your bird to actually get enough calories because they can just fill up on water. If your bird is consuming food with, 150% moisture relative to what the recommended content is, it might be difficult for them to actually get all of the nutrition that they need. So that's what we're working with here. There are other things in these diets like veggies, safflower seeds, which is what I use for training, flax oil for omega-3s. but really what we're looking at here are pretty comparable diets. We're going to dive into some of the differences here. Before we get into this in too great detail, there is a disclaimer here. So unfortified pellets are available for purchase on the market. I'm referring to these as commercial unfortified pellets. Unfortunately, all of the commercial unfortified pellets that I am aware of only provide us with information on, of course, the ingredients list. And we know that ingredients are listed in descending order. So those that, there are more of in the formulation will be in the first couple of ingredients. We know the guaranteed analysis. So that's your minimum amount of protein and fat and your maximum amount of fiber and moisture. We know that because that's legally required to be put on any food product sold for animals if it's above a certain quantity. And we know what the energy content is. What we don't know, which we need to know in order to do this analysis, is the mineral content and the vitamin content. We also don't know amino acid composition. That's important, really important. We don't know fatty acid composition. That's also really important. For the sake of just kind of keeping this as simple as we can, we're going to be really just focusing on mineral and vitamin content. So to get around this, we can try and have a best guess formulation. And so what I can do is I can look at the ingredients that are used in these pellets, and I can combine them in various different amounts until I end up with a nutrition profile that closely resembles the data that we are provided, which again is the energy content, protein, fat, fiber, and moisture. So you can see here these blue bars, that's the data we're provided for the commercial unfortified pellet, and the green bars are what I come up with in my kind of best guess unfortified pellet. And we're pretty close here. So if we look at protein and fat, we see my best guess unfortified pellet is really similar to the commercial unfortified pellet. It is a little bit more, but that's okay because crude protein and crude fat are listed as minimums. So we just need to make sure that we're not below this and are pretty close, and we satisfy that criteria. For crude fiber and moisture, again, we're pretty close here. For fiber and moisture, these are listed as maximums. So we just need to make sure that we're not above that value and we're either at it or slightly below. So all in all, this isn't perfect. That's really important to say. We do not know what the nutrient composition is of this unfortified pellet because that information isn't provided to us. We can either assume that anything that's not listed is not in there, which isn't fair to the commercial unfortified pellet, or we can do this type of formulation and try and figure out what it might be. And it's not going to be exact, but it's probably going to be pretty close. So that's what I'm using here in the unfortified diet, which has the unfortified pellets. It's this best guess unfortified pellet that I'm using in this diet. So first up, what we can do is we can compare the vitamin content in fortified versus unfortified pellet-based diet. So we're going to start here on the left, looking at two fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin D3 and vitamin E. This pink bar is for the fortified diet, and the orange is for the unfortified diet. You can see that for vitamin D3, there is no vitamin D3 in the unfortified diet. The reason for this is that there's not naturally occurring vitamin D3 in plant matter in any appreciable quantity. So it's really difficult to get your dietary need of vitamin D3 without supplementing it with synthetic vitamin D3. You can get vitamin D3 by UVB exposure. So if you live in an area where you can bring your bird outside, this really isn't very problematic. If you can bring your bird outside for 10, 15 minutes a day and have the sunshine on them, they're probably going to meet their vitamin D requirement. So this may or may not be a big deal. If you live in a climate like me, I live in Minnesota, where it's winter like 6 months of the year. That's probably an understatement. And our winters are like negative 30 degrees, right? Like I cannot bring, it doesn't matter that it's sunny for however many days a year. I can't bring my bird outside in that climate. So this may or may not matter depending on where you live. The vitamin E, you'll see, is pretty close here. We're at approximately 80%. And in the fortified diet, this might look really alarming, this 507%. The thing that's really important to note here is that vitamin E is one of the least toxic vitamins that we know of. So values above 100% are perfectly acceptable. Vitamin E is often used as a preservative in a wide variety of foods because its toxicity is so low. We can be exposed, and our animals can be exposed to so much of it, and it's perfectly fine. Your animal is much more likely to encounter hypovitaminosis E, which means they're not getting enough in their diet, and that can have some serious consequences. But hypervitaminosis E is exceptionally rare. I haven't heard of any cases of hypervitaminosis E in parrots. I do have a note here. Vitamin A is often the most concerning vitamin that we think of as companion parrot owners. We often think about parrots being deficient in vitamin A. In both of these diets, we're totally good on vitamin A because the chop is so high in beta carotene, which can be converted in the body into a usable form of vitamin A. We're totally fine. So we don't need to worry about that, which should be a big sigh of relief for most companion parrot owners. For the water-soluble vitamins, I do want to first state that there's not a ton of research on companion parrot needs for water-soluble vitamins. What we're using here are what we know about poultry and applying that to companion parrots. And it should be pretty similar. There's no evidence that suggests that it would be different. So we're pretty good here with the exception of pyridoxine or vitamin D6, vitamin B6, and vitamin B12. And we are pretty deficient as well. We also are deficient in biotin, but pyridoxine and vitamin B12 are super important vitamins, especially for growing birds. So, or birds that are molting or currently reproducing. Those are really important. So being deficient in those is not great and should be addressed. In the fortified diet, we're good across the board for water soluble vitamins. Next up, we've got our minerals. We have macrominerals and microminerals. Our macrominerals look pretty good across the board for fortified and unfortified diets. We're a little bit deficient in sodium in the unfortified diet, but 70% is pretty good. And in the microminerals, we are, again, pretty good, slightly deficient in manganese, slightly deficient in zinc, and we have no iodine. That's really bad. Iodine, we have iodized salt for a reason. Iodine deficiencies are really bad. It influences thyroid function. So not having iodine in the diet is something that should be addressed in this unfortified diet. Any questions on that before I move on?
My question is, what would these charts look like if we didn't provide chop?
Yeah, so if we didn't provide,
like a crazy question, I don't know.
I'd have to actually make the charts for that, but what I would expect to see is I didn't even plot vitamin A on this previous slide because you'll see that it's greater than 1,000% in both diets. It's greater than 1,000% in both diets because of the beta carotene, and the beta carotene is coming from the chop. So if we don't have the chop in there, on paper, our fortified diet is going to look like it's supplying enough vitamin A because there's vitamin A palmitate. I think it's usually vitamin A palmitate that's added to pellets. The problem is that vitamin A is really prone to degradation. So in normal conditions, so things just like light exposure, moisture, a little bit of heat, that can lead to rapid degradation of vitamin A. So on paper or on the package, it might look like your pellets do have sufficient amounts of vitamin A, something about 7 to 8 international units per gram. But so much of it might already be degraded, especially if you're purchasing pellets that are in a clear plastic bag that's not filtering out. It's letting light through, and light can degrade the vitamin A. So on paper, we would look good for vitamin A in the fortified. We might not be. You can still have vitamin A deficiencies if you're feeding 100% pellets, even if they're fortified. In the unfortified pellets, we would see significantly less vitamin A. I'd have to actually plot it to be able to tell you how much less it is. But again, it is going to be less. And then it's still going to be prone to all of these same storage problems. So having vegetables that are high in beta carotene in the diet, why that has been a long-term recommendation from avian veterinarians is because of the beta carotene, getting that vitamin A, because historically parrots have been super deficient in vitamin A. So that's probably the biggest thing. If there also wasn't CHOP, we would see differences in water soluble vitamins. The water soluble vitamins are also, a lot of them are coming from the CHOP. Things like the macro minerals and the micro minerals would look, they'd be different. But at least in the case of the fortified diet, we would still be meeting minimum requirements, and we would still be exceeding minimum requirements.
So point is, if you are feeding an unfortified pellet, you really need, like, you really need to make sure you're supplementing with CHOP.
Yeah, well, you really need to make sure you're supplementing with vegetables, right? The way that we usually talk about CHOP is, a chopped up mixture that you're preparing of all kinds of vegetables, and oftentimes there's grains in there. And in this case, we're looking at a mixture that has all kinds of vegetables and also some quinoa in it. You don't need the grains. You don't need a huge variety of vegetables to meet your beta carotene or meet the vitamin A requirements. You can feed things like dark leafy greens, bright orange vegetables like butternut squash, sweet potato. Those are also really high in beta carotene, and that can meet the requirements. I think that kind of brings up another point of CHOP is so popular that it can make it feel like if you're not feeding CHOP, you're doing something wrong. But, it is a trending thing right now, and you can absolutely feed your bird individual vegetables.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be this whole big thing. You will have to think about variability a little bit more, and, working with an avian veterinarian, or, a qualified nutritionist can be really helpful. In that case, to make sure that you
about
are
your parrot's preferences too, right? Some parrots would rather eat some CHOP than like a hunk of carrot or whatever.
Yeah, definitely. And I can, with my own bird, with Petrie, sometimes he just wants his CHOP, and he doesn't care about whole vegetables. And then he'll have weeks where all he wants are whole vegetables, and he doesn't want to even look at his CHOP. Or if you give him his CHOP, he just throws the bowl, right? So he makes his desires really well known. So yeah, like we said, a diet can look perfect on paper, but if your bird doesn't eat it, it's not good.
Right.
Yeah. So next stage here is fortified pellet diet, or fortified pellet based diet, compared to an unfortified pellet free diet. So this is going to be the diet that doesn't have any pellets in it, in order to make sure we are getting enough protein, and we're getting close to our fat needs and all of that. Although parrots don't have a recommended minimum amount of fat in their diet. They have fatty acid requirements, but not overall fat. We do need to add more grains and legumes to the diet to meet that requirement. So there is that difference here. So everything's going to look the same for the fortified diet as it did on the previous slides.
I actually have a question.
Yeah.
Are we assuming that this unfortified pellet free diet, they are using the best form of this diet? We're assuming.
Yeah.
So that's giving people a lot of grace. Just for me, like Stephanie's giving everyone a lot of grace who does feed their bird an unfortified pellet free diet, assuming that they are supplementing with beans and legumes and whatnot, which is really hard to
accomplish. And in the proper amounts as well.
Proper amounts, and then you have to make sure that your bird is eating all of it and not just select what he or she wants from the bowl. So that's just my little tidbit.
Yeah, that's definitely right. And, we kind of already touched on this. In the unfortified pellet-free diet, you are going to be combating water, which we don't think about being a problem.
I never think about the water. You always bring up the water. I'm like, oh yeah.
It's a big problem.
Yeah.
It can be difficult to get your bird. It's not just like they need to eat all of it. So not only do we have selectivity issues because nothing is in a pelleted form, it's just all they can pick through it. A lot of people try and combat this by finely chopping up CHOP and vegetables, and making it really, really fine to reduce how selective their bird can be. But I can tell you, if a bird wants to be selective about what they're eating, it doesn't matter if it's a hyacinth macaw. They're going to be selective about what they're eating. They can do it.
You've seen like a bogey husk, like a tiny little millet seed. I mean, that's what they've evolved to be able to do. They're very good at foraging.
So they're really, really good at that. We need to give their we need to give them their biology credit. They're really good at doing these things, which can be really frustrating for us. And it makes it one of the many joys of living with birds.
So
They're
hard.
challenging. They're
Yeah.
challenging. So vitamin D3, again, we have the same problem. Vitamin E was only slightly deficient in the pelleted unfortified diet. In this diet, we are pretty severely deficient in vitamin E. So again, remember I talked earlier about how, vitamin E toxicity is basically non-existent, but hypovitaminosis E, not getting enough, that is something that veterinarians can see. And that's important. So, that can be a problem here. Our water soluble vitamins, again, look pretty similar to the unfortified diet that contained pellets. We're still having deficiencies kind of in various B vitamins, and that's all. I'm only showing B vitamins here. I guess kind of a difference is it's not only pyridoxine, biotin, and vitamin B12 that are deficient. We also are seeing some slight deficiencies in niacin and riboflavin as well. So all of that is to say we do have some deficiencies. Some of them are more severe than in the in the unfortified pelleted diet. So moving on to macrominerals, microminerals. Macrominerals in the diet that contained pellets but was unfortified looked pretty good, slightly deficient in sodium. We are now, you'll notice, pretty deficient in calcium. We're at 72%. That might not seem that deficient. It's above 70%. Here's the problem. Our calcium to phosphorus ratio is way out of whack. Ordinarily, we want to see a calcium phosphorus ratio that's higher in calcium than it is phosphorus, or is at least 1-to-1. And that can be a pretty complex topic, which we can talk about at another time. But calcium and phosphorus kind of work in opposite to each other in the body. So if you have too much of one or too much of another, that can influence how these ions, calcium ion and phosphorus ion, interact in the body and how they're able to be utilized. So ordinarily, we want a minimum of 1-to-1. And ideally, we want something more like 2-to-1. And most birds can tolerate up to 4-to-1, so 4 times as much calcium as phosphorus. We're looking at percentages here of the required minimum, but you are saying that we have way more total phosphorus in the diet than we do calcium, and that can present issues. We are still a little bit deficient in sodium. Manganese, we're deficient. We're actually good on zinc in this diet. We were deficient in zinc on the other diet. And again, we don't have any iodine. So I guess we'll go to the summary. So the summary here, we've talked about this as we were talking, but just to kind of put it all together, because I know it's a lot. In our unfortified pellet-based diet, we do have comparable macronutrient and moisture content, but there's a big caveat here. This diet is alfalfa based. So I said that in the beginning. Remember, we're looking at the ingredients. Alfalfa is the first ingredient. Alfalfa digestibility is pretty unknown in companion parrots. It's not a recommended base for poultry either. What we do know is that corn-based diets are highly digestible. The same cannot be said for alfalfa. Alfalfa can be more difficult to digest. In poultry, diets up to 10% containing alfalfa have shown to be beneficial and well tolerated, but above this is not really something that we have data on. So unfortunately, for me, this is an example of a diet that might look one way on paper, but we just don't know how it's going to do in the body because, to the best of my knowledge, there haven't been feeding trials of these types of pellets, these alfalfa-based unfortified pellets. There haven't been feeding trials. They're not formulated to meet these required minimums that are set forth by the Avian Association of Avian Veterinarians. That's where we're getting all these numbers from in the first place. It's a very reliable source. So, you kind of have to, no pun intended, you kind of have to take this with a grain of salt because we just don't know if it really is digestible.
And it's important to note that all of this stuff is like, it can affect your parrot long term. So that's what it's a little bit like, I think we see a lot of oh, I switched my parrot's diet and now behavior changed like
Mhm.
overnight, and like there's so many implications to even saying that.
Yeah,
What we're worried about is long-term effects
yeah,
of these parrots and like,
yeah.
what vets have to see when the bird is 20 years old and, there's issues with bone growth or liver or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, in baby birds, nutritional deficiencies, they can be apparent really early on, right? Because baby birds have, growing birds.
Mm.
So, we also see this with, well, we say we, I mean, avian veterinarians, not, I'm not part of that. I want to make that clear. Please don't send me questions that are better suited for an avian vet. But, you know, if a baby bird is not getting the nutrition that they need, they can end up with a lot of nutrition related disorders. They can end up with, you know, there are young birds under a year old that have liver failure
Mm.
because they're not getting a right diet. I mean, rickets, right? That's a disease that, is plagues baby birds. When we're talking about adult birds, it's kind of a different story. Nutrition related disorders can take years, decades to develop. It's not like what we're talking about with baby birds, or, kind of the one exception are actively laying females that, have to produce an egg. Um, these types of, where you would start to see clinically apparent symptoms can happen so far down the road, at which point you're no longer dealing with preventative medicine, which is nutrition. You're dealing with ramifications. You're trying to clean up, what could have been prevented through dietary measures. So yeah, so it's a really good point. So where we're at with this unfortified pellet-based diet, we're severely deficient in vitamin D3. Again, if you can bring your bird outside on, a regular basis, this isn't a big deal. Certain B vitamins, including B12, this is in italics, right? Because we can guess that B vitamins are probably pretty important to birds. We have a pretty good idea of recommended minimums for other species. This isn't something that's been super explicitly looked at in companion parrots. So it's in italics there just to kind of say, hey, take it with a grain of salt. Iodine, that's kind of a pun because iodized salt. Iodine, we're severely deficient in that. That can be incredibly problematic and lead to all kinds of thyroid disorders. We're moderately deficient in vitamin E, sodium, manganese, and zinc. We see really, really similar things in the unfortified pellet-free diet. And I want everyone to think about that for a moment, because the unfortified pellet-based diet and the unfortified pellet-free diet on paper look pretty similar, with the exception of the incredibly high moisture content in that pellet-free
And
diet.
that's with you giving people,
A
you're
lot of
assuming
benefit.
you're assuming people are doing this unfortified pellet-free diet perfectly, which
Yes, this is
I do not have as much grace for. Like, it's just not what people do, but we'll give it to
people
them.
tend to have, a very kitchen sink approach to diet. And, a lot of the times that's perfect for humans because we have such a varied diet and, we do things like,
Well, our
get
food is fortified.
a lot of our food is
Our food
fortified.
is so fortified because we don't
Yes,
reach requirements. So it's, yeah.
exactly. That's why we have iodized salt. Right. I mean, we eat so many fortified foods in
Yeah.
order to, maintain our health. And, we can communicate. We can feel something is off, and we have agency to bring ourselves to the doctor and say, hey, I think something is off, and let's get some blood work and let's do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, parrots hide their symptoms. They're
Hide their
literally the
symptoms.
hardest animal to like
Yeah. And they
diagnose.
can't communicate. They can't communicate to us, hey, I'm feeling a little bit fatigued. Maybe I'm not getting enough X, Y, and Z, right? I mean,
Right.
at the point at which you're seeing these types of clinical signs, if you have an adult bird that's just having a maintenance diet, I mean, it's going to be years down the road. I think there's a podcast with avian veterinarian Dr. Scott Eccles, um, on the Avian Behavior podcast, which is Avian Behavior International's Hillary Henke's podcast. And, he has this great point of saying, a lot of the times we think of the heart attack as being, like the symptom, that the heart attack was the symptom, but the heart attack is the end result, right? The heart attack comes from or it can come from, and it often comes from in parrots, a really poor diet, right? A diet that is over supplementing fat. A lot of the times in this unfortified pellet free diet, it's really hard to meet calorie needs because of this high water content. And what a lot of people end up inadvertently doing, they don't do it purposefully, but they end up a lot of the times providing a lot more seed and a lot more nut than they think they are providing. And that's pretty much what the bird is consuming all day. They might be looking like they're consuming some chop, some whatever else you're providing them, but a lot of what they're eating and where they're getting most of their calories from, a lot of the times is seed and nuts. So I mean, how this idealized unfortified pellet free diet that we just talked about, which is really idealized and it's still deficient in a lot of nutrients, is still pretty impractical, and it's still pretty different from the reality of the situation.
Steph, I got a few questions. So one of them was that the nutrients, or some of the nutrients that were found, were more than 100%, the required minimum. Is this a problem?
Yeah, it's not really a problem. So there's a couple things to consider here. The first is that maximum daily allowances haven't been established. So really what we're looking at is just percent of required minimum. Being over that doesn't necessarily mean that we're above the maximum.
Okay. That makes sense.
So yeah, we know what a lot of the toxic thresholds are. We're well below that. The other thing that we need to recognize here is that for water soluble nutrients, like all those B vitamins that I was showing, being above 100%, even, being above 300%, a lot of those are just going to be excreted, right? Water soluble vitamins we lose every day very easily. So it's really not something that we need to worry about. With the fat soluble vitamins, we do need to be careful about it. Vitamin D3 is the only vitamin that I've shown today that has a maximum. And we were, above 100% the minimum in the fortified pellets, but we were still only at 30% of the maximum.
Right.
Yeah. So we're still well below that, maximum threshold that could lead to toxicity, because vitamin D3 toxicity is, that does happen. We need to be aware of it.
Okay. And then my other question is, some of the deficient nutrients in unfortified pellets are still at over 70% required minimum. So is it really this huge, big of a deal? Or are we just looking at colorful graphs?
Yeah, so for those, that's why, kind of on my last slide there, I broke it up into severely deficient and moderately deficient. Severely deficient, we're looking at like under 40% of required minimum. If you're above that, like 70%, like you said, that, that's going to be moderately deficient. There is not really, right? I mean, we're pretty close. We're doing a pretty good job. That difference could be made up in just, swapping out your chop recipe every once in a while. You can also do things like, if you're looking at the diet and you're working with someone who is able to show you, the exact nutrient breakdown of the diet you're feeding, then you'll know what you're deficient in, and you can select food items that are particularly high in those specific nutrients, and you can incorporate them into the diet another way. You can use them as foraging materials, or, once or twice a week, instead of feeding your chop, you can feed something different, right? Thinking about the diet as an overall average, as opposed to every single food item being perfect, will make your life easier.
Makes sense. Okay. And then we kind of went over this, but it looks like the unfortified diets are doing a pretty decent job at meeting the minimum requirements for a lot of the nutrients. So am I missing something? Are the rest of the world, or like the people feeding their parrots this diet, missing something? Could there be anything else out there that we need to worry about?
Yeah. So again, like how something looks on paper is really only a small part of it's an important part of the story, but it's a small part of the story. We also need to take into account things like digestibility. That's going to have really big influence on, usable protein, carbohydrates. How is the animal actually processing the food? That's basically what we're talking about with the digestibility. And, just looking at nutrients on a paper doesn't give us that information. So that's kind of my cautionary tale about the unfortified pellet-based diets being alfalfa-based. We don't have a lot of data to support that. So, personally for me, I wouldn't feel comfortable feeding those pellets until I've seen data to support using alfalfa as a base of the diet. So I would look for feeding trials where they're explicitly monitoring, excreta and other nutrient biomarkers in the blood, a real feeding trial to give me that kind of confidence, because it is going against, or I don't want to say it's going against, it's not necessarily in line with current information that we have and
Standards.
Yes. So that's one part of it. The other part of it, like we talked about, is the water content and selectivity issues, right? So a diet could look perfect on paper, but if your bird's not eating it, or they're only eating part of it, then they're not going to be getting everything that you think that they're getting. And that's a really, really common scenario. We often severely inaccurately estimate what we are eating as humans. We often really, really underestimate the amount of calories we're consuming, for example. So, it's just difficult to try and imagine how, just looking at our bird who throw out so much food, I mean, they waste so much food, trying to figure it out can be really challenging.
With everything that was said, my main takeaways are, well, besides the whole, now that you took the unfortified pellet free diet, is not only, in my opinion, more work, more expensive, harder for your bird, for you to guarantee that your bird is eating that as a whole, and harder to formulate. I think our world and our society almost likes to glorify these specialized diets. I've fallen prey to it, or I've been a victim, I should say, not fallen prey, but I've been a victim of this in my own life. We want this specialized, almost cure all. What I hear from you is that these, more basic pellets or diet actually are very safe. They're affordable. They're easy to get. There's something that you can have consistency with, which is really beautiful, because in just life, consistency, from what I've seen, is key. And then there's kind of that middle ground of the unfortified pelleted diet, which is maybe a little bit more high maintenance, maybe a little bit more expensive, and then there's still deficiencies there. So not trying to sell anyone any specific diet, but personally, I would feel more comfortable using a pellet that was designed by someone much smarter than me, to fit my parrot's needs perfectly, and then supplement to make sure they're getting the veg, they're getting the vitamin, which one was it? A, that's super important. Getting that vitamin A. But yeah, I think what I want to shout from the rooftop is, you don't have to spend, birds are already expensive. We don't have to spend all this money for them to have this niche exclusive diet. And that niche exclusive expensive diet could actually be harming your bird in the long term.
Or best case scenario, it's doing the same thing. It just costs more. That's your best case scenario.
You're slaving in the kitchen more, or you're like confused. You're mixing things, and it's just so much more work.
And again, like we do not sell diets. That's not what we do. Like, that's not who we are. That's not what we're about. I'm happy to always talk diets and nutrition. If I were to try and sell you, in a proverbial sense, one thing today, it would be talk with your avian veterinarian. That is like the single most important thing. I think a lot of the times with these kind of specialized diets, we want to be in the know. We want to be in that, niche group of feeding something that's really specialized, and it can make it feel like we're doing a really good job, and it can give us this sense of satisfaction of, we're going above and beyond. We're putting so much work into this. A lot of the times you'll hear people say, my bird eats better than I do. I put more time and effort into my bird's diet than I put into my own diet. And it's kind of talked about in this like prideful way. And what I will say is that you doing a lot of work, or you not doing a lot of work, doesn't mean that there wasn't a lot of work behind the scenes to get you a high quality, simple product.
That's so true.
Because I mean,
I like, my thing too is, it's like, birds are already so complex and they're so difficult, and I try to talk about this as much as I can on this channel. So let's like let the experts spend all that time so we can declutter that aspect of owning a parrot, and we can really focus on the behavior aspect and the training. Like that's what makes me excited. And having been so stressed out about Bogey's diet, meeting you, obviously we've known each other for forever, but talking about this stuff and really diving into the nitty-gritty of this makes me feel so good and makes me realize that we need to have a special lens on. We need to have our spectacles on of really focusing on when marketing is bullshitting us.
Yep.
And
are you about to say bullshitting on YouTube? Not for children.
Will they demonetize me because I make so much? Thank you so much for the time. And I just hope that everyone here knows that we're just trying to spread the word and get the most parrots on a good diet, that they're healthy and easy. I don't know. I'm burnt. I'm
learned too much.
This was amazing. We're going to link everything below so you all will be able to click on our blog posts and our guides, and just stay tuned on our various Instagrams and on this channel and our TikTok and
all the social media.
Too much social media.
All of the trials and tribulations of social media. Stay tuned for our social media.
Story of my life. Thank you so much for watching our YouTube videos. By watching our videos, you directly support Bogey and I, which we greatly appreciate. If you want to see even more content bird related, please be sure to check out our website, nerdybirdcollective.com, where we have free guides. You can subscribe and get updates through blogs. You can also reach me directly on our Instagram, which is Bogey the Galah. I personally reach out to everyone who messages me with a response in a timely fashion. Thanks again, and hope to see you soon.